So I really wanted to talk, I guess, a little more about what sex ed needs to look like at home. As kids are growing up. I mean, when is the first time to start introducing some of these ideas? And I guess, when we talk about sex ed, what we're really talking about is, issues related to gender identity, puberty, all of these different things that we sort of put under the eroticism label. That maybe gets in the way. So, with all of that in mind, where do you start?
Yeah, so the best case scenario is that you're not looking at it from that old adage of the talk. Right?
Sure, yeah, right. Like it's a single uncomfortable conversation.
No, that's uncomfortable because that was made uncomfortable by making it one talk that's late. So ideally, you're starting early and you're having ongoing conversations and they progress, right? So what parents and caregivers need to understand is that sexuality exists in a lifespan. It's not something that humans age into or become horny teenagers and then all of a sudden that's sexuality.
Just one day you become a sexual creature.
Yeah.
Right. So when you have infants, they're developing attachment. You're developing bonds, and there's that intimacy there. So again, this isn't about adult sexuality or eroticism, but there are intimate bonds and a connection that is created. And so usually I say if you're a parent and you have infants, then starting with using accurate terms to talk about body parts in points of care. So when you're changing diapers and you have a child with a penis, you have a child, with a vulva or their genitals, then you use those words. Now I'm going to, change your diaper. And this isn't about, at that stage, asking permission for those things, but you're also laying foundations of consent and the fact that before, bodies are touched, that there's a conversation that happens, and it gets you, the parent, the caregiver, in the habit of using these accurate terms. And then as they progress into, the toddler stages, then those early consent kind of messaging happen. And sometimes, too, it's about how we talk to other people about their access to children that we're raising. So when you have those strangers that just want to reach out and touch or hug or feel entitled to that kind of thing, that's a point where as a caregiver, you can set that boundary and say, please ask permission, before you reach out and touch. Consent is really important to us in our home, and we want our child to grow up understanding their body autonomy. And so before it's about sex, it's about things like body awareness, so helping your child to understand how they can care for their own bodies, the names of their body parts. Those things support safety, their understanding of a safe and unsafe touch, right, of who trusted adults are in their lives. And also if you have sibling dynamics or they have other kids or they're in school, then just supporting the messaging around consent and making sure that, like, one rule that we have in our home is that nobody says no or stop or sets a boundary more than once. Once someone says no, that's it. That's, and we do ask permission, for may I give you a hug? So there's not an entitlement, to bodies. That children that I raise are human beings and they deserve respect. And so when you can create that culture early on, that understanding that they have a voice and that they know how to speak up for themselves, then those kinds of things lay that foundation that can make the Me Too movement that we saw for our current adult generation, a lot of us who are tickled past the point of, comfort. There are, again, those experiences before it has anything to do with sex. And then, yes, then it can progress into puberty conversations. We want to talk to kids about media literacy. And so talking about porn, how they can be good digital citizens, those things need to start a lot earlier because kids are gaining access to cell phones and the internet and YouTube and devices. So it's all these, like, foundational things. It's not just one talk, and just creates a deeper connection with your child. So when it does become about sex, it's not awkward because you've already let them know that their curiosities are welcome, And then when it comes to gender identity, just making sure that we're not inhibiting their expression of who they are. That there's not, these are boy toys and these are girl toys, or that this is a color. None of these things are truly gendered. That's all constructed, by our society. So when children are free to express themselves, they're free to experiment and play, then those things support their early development of who they really are and their expression of themselves.
I mean, as we're sitting here, I'm reminded one of us is wearing nail polish and
has long hair.
It's not us. So I think that's a really important message to remember too, is like you were saying, those early messages. I don't think parents quite realize just how impactful their words can be and exactly which messages the kids take and which they leave.
And their silence.
Yes.
Parents' silence. That's the thing, is that children are learning, whether you want to see it or realize it or not, children are learning about sexuality from the very, very beginning. So those conversations that get avoided, or, one thing I talk a lot about is if I grew up in a house where if sex scenes came on the television.
Right, it's like,
yeah, absolutely.
They were like, turn around. And
putting blankets over the TV for a couple of minutes, or yeah.
Y'all had blankets?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I remember even in high school just being so frustrated by that, because to me, we should be talking about like the messages of these films and whether they have the right values for our kids rather than this specific imagery, So I had dinner a couple of years ago with a friend of mine, maybe when his new daughter, was 2 or 3 years old. And he was kind of complaining to me about how his wife, he said, was really frigid and she was really sexually repressed and uncomfortable. And then he pivoted to talking about his daughter and how she wouldn't have a vagina until she was 22. For now, she had like a hoo-ha or a vajayjay or
a nani or something. Yeah.
And I mean, we basically just had to walk away from the conversation because there was nothing I could say to help him recognize how tied together those two things are.
And how damaging it could be.
Yeah, absolutely. And he eventually, by the time we wrapped it up, he got to the point of, well, this isn't so much an issue of right or wrong, it's an issue of I'm just uncomfortable. And I was like, okay, so you're uncomfortable, you're the grown-up, grow the fuck up and do something about it. It's wrong not to. And he wasn't ready for that. But, I guess I'm to understand that kind of damage or that kind of language is really damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to make sure, again, from that safety standpoint, that we equip children with the words, with the knowledge, with the resources, with the support, so that if we never want to think that would happen, but if something were to happen that was unsafe to our child, that they would be able to communicate that. They would have the tools to be able to speak that. And so if a child is saying, someone touched my cookie or made me touch, their, wiener or things like that, like this is where, from a legal perspective too, if a case, has to be brought into court, then that gives that wiggle room, for
the ambiguity of the terms.
Yeah. So when children can communicate clearly and concisely and use language, because, a common activity that, we do within sex ed classes is, putting words like, ear, nose, legs, and we say, all right, how many, going to give you a minute and write down as many slang terms or other words for these body parts. And then you have them like, ear,
schnoz, lobe. There's not a lot there.
Right. So they get very few, and they're just like, and then you throw up words like penis, like vulva or vagina, or breasts, or anus, right? And the flood.
Suddenly.
Oh yeah. the flood of slang terms comes because, and that's shame. That's shame, and that's what's been projected. And so we've got to remove that from our future generations. But something you pointed out that is important is that the journey starts with us always. And so when we are noticing that discomfort, or we're putting up a boundary, that's information, and that does call for us to kind of go back and look at, where did that come from? Where did I get those messages? Because this is not innate. This is not something that, we're born with, this a semblance of shame around these things. This is taught to us. We pick this up, again, on those things that are said, that are not said, that are done, that are not done. So we're always teaching our children about sex and their bodies and relationships, even if we're not having a pointed conversation. They've learned and they picked up, and they learn how to survive within their environments, who they can talk to, what they can say, what's acceptable, what's appropriate. So I can often have parents who may have like tweens or teens who haven't created an open culture, who may say, oh, I try to talk about these things, and they're like, ew, that's so weird, that's so awkward. And I'm like, that's feedback. It's not that what you're talking about, the subject, is not weird, awkward, or bad.
It's that you feel weird and awkward about discussing it.
An environment has been created that is making this that way.
Yeah, it's the culture in general that's also feeding into that. And so there is going to be a little bit of pushback against that.
And just like it's been constructed, it can be deconstructed. It's never too late.